In a modest coastal town where gossip traveled faster than the morning ferry, Elira Voss lived quietly above her uncle's bookbinding shop. At 23, she rarely spoke in crowds and kept her hands busy mending spines of old novels or sketching melodies in the margins of discarded sheet music. No one knew she could play piano, least of all the regulars at the Marigold Lounge, the town's only venue with a slightly out-of-tune upright in the corner. One rainy Thursday, the lounge's usual pianist canceled last minute. Desperate, the owner, a gruff man named Rafe, scanned the room for anyone who might know a few chords. Elira, there only to return a borrowed poetry anthology, raised her hand almost by accident. Laughter rippled through the room, some mocking, some pitying. They remembered her as the quiet girl who once spilled tea on the mayor's shoes during the summer fair. But before anyone could stop her, Elira walked to the piano, brushed dust from the bench, and sat. Part 2. The weight of silence. Elira hadn't touched a real piano in nearly a decade, not since her grandmother passed. Back then, in a sunlit cottage on the cliffs, Nana Morell had taught her to listen before she played. Music isn't in your fingers. Child, it's in your breath. But after the funeral, Elira's parents, practical folk who valued ledgers over lullabies, sold the old piano to pay for repairs on their fishing boat. She never protested. Instead, she practiced silently, tapping rhythms on tabletops, humming harmonies while folding laundry, imagining keys beneath her fingertips. Now facing the smirking crowd at the Marigold, her palms were damp. She closed her eyes, placed her hands on the yellowed keys, and let the silence stretch just long enough for doubt to bloom. Then she began, not with a flourish but with a single, clear note that hung in the air like a question. Part 3. The Unfolding Storm. What followed wasn't a showy concerto or a pop hit. It was something raw and original, a piece she'd composed in her head over years of quiet longing. It started slow, like waves gathering strength, then swelled into a cascade of chords that seemed to echo the crash of the sea against the harbor walls. The chatter died. Glasses stopped clinking. Even Rafe, arms crossed by the bar, uncrossed them without realizing. A fisherman named Torin, known for his loud opinions and louder boots, stood frozen mid-sip. The melody wove through memories, Nana Morell's humming, the creak of the bookshop stairs, the ache of unsaid words, and transformed them into something universal. By the time Elira reached the final crescendo, tears glistened on more than one cheek. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for 3 full heartbeats, then erupted. Part 4. After the applause. The applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous. People surged forward not to gawk, but to thank her. A retired music teacher pressed a worn metronome into her hand. A teenage girl whispered, "I didn't know someone like you could make something like that." But not everyone was moved. A local radio host, Darius Kell, who'd once dismissed Elira as that shy book girl, now saw a story and a chance to boost his fading show. He offered her a live segment the next week. Meanwhile, Elira retreated to the bookshop overwhelmed. Her uncle Silas simply handed her a cup of chamomile tea and said, "You don't owe them anything. But if you want to play again, I'll be there." That night, she dreamed of keys glowing in the dark. By morning, she'd made a decision, not for fame, but for the music that had lived inside her too long. Part 5. A different kind of stage Elira didn't become an overnight sensation. She declined record deals that demanded she tone down the melancholy. Instead, she began hosting monthly listening nights at the Marigold. No microphones, no recordings, just piano and presence. She invited others to share, a war veteran with a harmonica, a baker who sang folk songs from his childhood island, a boy who recited poetry about starlings. The events grew, not in spectacle, but in depth. Years later, when a documentary crew asked what changed that rainy night, Elira smiled faintly. "Nothing changed. I just stopped hiding what was already there." And in that small town, where people once laughed at the quiet girl who dared to touch the piano, music became less about performance and more about permission, to feel, to remember, to be seen. In the quiet town of Brinley Cove, where seagulls argued over fish scraps and the harbor bells rang every hour like clockwork, Elira Voss lived above a bookbinding shop that smelled of glue, old paper, and cedarwood. She was 23, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hands that moved like they were always listening for something just out of reach. Most folks in town barely noticed her. She wasn't loud, didn't wear bright colors, and never showed up at the summer bonfires or the Friday night trivia at the Marigold Lounge. To them, she was just the quiet girl who helped her uncle mend torn covers and rebind cookbooks for the local library. But Elira wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she saved her voice for other things, like the way rain tapped on window panes or how the wind whistled through the alley behind the bakery at dusk. And sometimes when no one was around, she'd sit on the floor of her tiny attic room and press her fingers against the wooden floorboards, pretending they were piano keys. She'd close her eyes and play whole songs in her head, songs she'd never written down, but that lived in her bones like memories she hadn't been born with yet. No one in Brinley Cove knew she could play piano. Not really. Years ago, when she was just a child, her grandmother, Nana Morell, had taught her on a battered upright that sat in their seaside cottage. That piano had been old even then, its keys chipped and yellowed like old teeth, but to Elira it was magic. Nana never taught her to read sheet music. Instead, she'd say, "Listen first. The music's already in the air. You just have to catch it." So Elira learned to listen, to the rhythm of the tides, to the creak of the porch swing, to the silence between heartbeats, and when she finally placed her small hands on the keys, the notes came out like breath. But Nana passed away when Elira was 13. After that, everything changed. Her parents, practical people who measured worth in boat repairs and grocery bills, sold the piano to fix the hull of their fishing skiff. Elira didn't cry. She just stopped humming. She packed away the melodies and tucked them deep inside, where no one could hear them. She threw herself into helping at the bookshop, learning to stitch spines and press pages flat. She became good at making broken things whole again, except herself. Now, 10 years later, she moved through life like a shadow. She spoke only when spoken to, smiled only when necessary, and never drew attention. She liked it that way. It felt safer. But on this particular Thursday, the sky hung low and gray, spitting rain in fits and starts, and Elira found herself walking down Harbor Street with a slim volume of Rilke's poetry tucked under her coat. She was returning it to Leo, the bartender at the Marigold, who'd borrowed it weeks ago and kept forgetting to give it back. She didn't mind. Leo was kind in a rough-around-the-edges sort of way, and he always slipped her a warm scone when she came by. The Marigold Lounge wasn't fancy. It had mismatched chairs, a dartboard with too many holes, and a jukebox that only played songs from the 1970s. But in the far corner, beneath a flickering wall sconce, stood an old, upright piano. Its finish was dull, one leg slightly shorter than the others, and someone had carved L+J4 EVR into the side. It hadn't been played in months, maybe years. The regulars called it the ghost piano, half joking that it only worked when the moon was full. That night, though, the lounge was unusually full. Word had spread that the weekly pianist, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Driscoll, had come down with the flu. Without her gentle Chopin and occasional show tunes, the place felt empty, too loud in the wrong way. People talked over each other, laughter too sharp, glasses clinking like warning bells. Rafe, the owner, a bear of a man with salt and pepper stubble and a voice like gravel, paced behind the bar, muttering about dead air and lost ambiance. Then he spotted Elira near the door, handing the poetry book to Leo. "You," Rafe barked, pointing. "You're Nana Morell's granddaughter, right?" Elira froze. "Yes. Didn't you used to tinker on that old piano of hers?" She nodded barely. Rafe's eyes lit up like he'd just found a $20 bill in his coat pocket. "Well, we're in a bind. Mrs. Driscoll's out." "Anyone in here know how to play?" He turned to the room, arms wide. A few people chuckled. Someone yelled, "My dog howls better than I play." Then a voice from the back, Torin, a fisherman known for his booming laugh and sharper tongue, called out, "Hey, let the book girl try. Bet she's got dust in her ears instead of music." The room erupted in laughter. Not cruel exactly, more like the kind of teasing Brinley Cove reserved for anyone who didn't quite fit the mold. Elira felt her cheeks burn. She took a step back, ready to slip out the door, but Rafe, desperate, held up a hand. "Come on, Elira, just a few notes, anything, we'll buy you dinner." She hesitated. The rain tapped against the windows. The piano sat there, silent and waiting, like it remembered her. Something inside her shifted. Not a decision exactly, but a release. like a door she'd kept locked for years had finally creaked open. Without a word, she walked across the room. The laughter faded into confused murmurs. She brushed a layer of dust off the piano bench, sat down and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. They were cool, slightly sticky in places. One key stuck when she pressed it. But it was real, solid. Hers in a way nothing had been in a long time. For a long moment she just sat there, eyes closed, breathing. The room grew quiet, not out of politeness but curiosity. Even Torrin stopped chewing his pretzel. Then slowly she placed her hands on the keys and played. Not a famous song. Not something flashy. Just a single note, clear, soft, and steady, like the first drop of rain after a drought. It hung in the air, fragile and sure, and in that moment the entire room leaned forward, not knowing they were about to hear something that would change how they saw the quiet girl from the bookshop. Forever. The note wasn't perfect. The piano was out of tune and the key stuck slightly on the release. But it rang out anyway, clear, honest, and full of something no one in the room could name. It wasn't showy, it wasn't loud, but it held the space like a promise. A few people exchanged glances. Torrin stopped chewing. Leo leaned against the bar with his arms crossed, eyebrows raised. Rafe stood frozen, a beer bottle halfway to the counter. Elira didn't open her eyes. She let her hands find their own way, as if they remembered a path her mind had long since buried. At first it was just a simple melody, 3 notes repeating, then shifting like waves rolling in and out. But soon more joined. Her left hand found a low, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat underwater. Her right wove a thread of sound above it, sometimes hesitant, sometimes sure, always searching. She wasn't playing a song anyone knew. This was something she'd carried inside for years, shaped by sleepless nights and rainy afternoons, by the ache of missing someone who'd loved her without condition. It was the sound of walking home alone from the post office, of watching gulls circle above the lighthouse, of folding laundry while listening to the radio through thin walls. Ordinary moments stitched together with longing, and yet as the music grew it didn't feel small. It felt huge, like the sky opening up after a storm. In the back corner a woman named Marla, owner of the yarn shop down the street, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She didn't know why. She just felt something loosen in her chest like a knot she'd forgotten was there. Near the window, a teenager named Eli, who'd come in to escape the rain and scroll on his phone, had stopped scrolling. He stared at his hands, then at Elira, then back at his hands, as if wondering what his own life might sound like if someone played it on piano. Even Torrin, who'd laughed loudest just minutes before, sat with his elbows on the table, chin resting on his knuckles. His usual smirk was gone. In its place was something softer, something like wonder. Elira still hadn't opened her eyes. She didn't need to. The music wasn't for them. Not at first. It was for Nana Morell, for the little girl who used to press her ear against the piano's wooden side, just to feel the vibrations. For the years she'd spent pretending she didn't miss it. But as the melody deepened, swelling into something richer, more complex, she began to feel their presence. Not as judgment, but as witness. And that changed something. Her fingers grew bolder. She leaned into the keys, letting the music rise and fall like breath. A minor chord gave way to a major one. A pause stretched just long enough to make hearts ache. Then without warning, the tempo shifted. Faster now, urgent, like running toward something just out of sight. The piano groaned in places, its age showing. But Elira didn't fight it. She worked with it, around it, through it. She made the imperfections part of the song, and then just as suddenly as it had begun, she slowed again. The notes grew sparse, thoughtful. One by one they drifted away until only a single tone remained, held long enough to shimmer, then released into silence. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Then someone clapped. It was Leo. Just one slow, deliberate clap. Then another, and another. That broke the spell. The room erupted, not in cheers but in something deeper. People stood. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply stared at Elira like they were seeing her for the first time. Rafe walked over, his usual gruffness gone, and placed a hand gently on the piano lid. Where did that come from?" he asked, voice rough. Elira finally opened her eyes. They were bright, a little dazed. I don't know, she said softly. It's just... Been there. She stood, suddenly overwhelmed. The warmth of the room, the weight of all those eyes. It pressed in on her like a tide. She mumbled something about needing to get back to the shop and hurried toward the door before anyone could stop her. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. She walked quickly, arms wrapped around herself, heart still racing. She expected to feel relief or maybe embarrassment, but instead she felt lighter. Like she'd set down a bag she'd been carrying for 10 years without realizing how heavy it was. Back at the bookbinding shop, her Uncle Silas was bent over his workbench, gluing the spine of a 1920s gardening manual. He looked up when she came in, took one look at her face, and didn't ask what happened. He just nodded toward the kettle. "Tea?" he said. She nodded. As the water heated, she sat at the small table by the window, watching the streetlights reflect in the wet cobblestones. Her fingers still tingled. She flexed them slowly, marveling at how alive they felt. Silas placed a steaming mug in front of her, chamomile, her favorite, and sat across from her. He didn't pry. He never did. But after a long silence, he said, "Your grandmother always said music finds its way out, even if you try to lock it in." Elira looked at him. "I didn't think anyone remembered her." "People remember," he said gently. "They just forget to say it." She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her skin. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the quiet girl who faded into the background. She felt seen. Not for what she said or did, but for what she carried inside. Later that night, lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. The melody kept playing in her head, not the whole thing, just fragments. A turn of phrase here, a rhythm there. And for the first time, she didn't push it away. She let it stay. She let it breathe. Somewhere in town, a radio host named Darius Kell was scribbling notes in a leather journal. He'd been at the Marigold that night, nursing a whiskey and nursing his own disappointment. His show's ratings were slipping, and he needed a story. Something real. Something human. He'd heard the whispers on his way out. "Did you see Elira Voss play?" "I had no idea." It was like she opened a door and let us all walk through. By morning, he'd made a decision. He'd call the bookbinding shop, ask if she'd come on the air. But Elira didn't know that yet. All she knew was this: the music wasn't gone. It never had been. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding it. The next morning, Brinley Cove woke up different. Not in any dramatic way, no parades, no headlines, but in the quiet shifts that only small towns notice. At the bakery, 2 customers who usually rushed through their orders lingered by the window, talking about the piano music they'd heard the night before. At the post office, the clerk hummed a tune she couldn't quite place but felt strangely comforted by. Even the gulls seemed to cry softer over the harbor. Elira, however, woke up with a knot in her stomach. She'd replayed the night in her head a dozen times, each version more embarrassing than the last. Had she really played in front of everyone? Had she lost control? What if they thought she was showing off? She pulled the blanket over her head and groaned. Downstairs, the bell above the shop door chimed, then again, and again. By mid-morning, a steady trickle of people had come by, not to drop off books, but just to say hello. To thank her, a retired schoolteacher pressed a small tin of lavender shortbread into her hands. A young mother with a baby in a sling said, "My daughter stopped crying the moment you started playing," like she understood. Elira didn't know what to say. She just nodded, cheeks warm, and retreated behind the counter whenever she could. Her Uncle Silas watched it all with quiet amusement. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just kept working, stitching pages with steady hands as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis overnight. Around noon, the phone rang. Silas answered it, listened for a moment, then held it out to Elira. "It's for you." She took the receiver like it might burn her. "Hello? Elira Voss?" came a smooth, practiced voice. "This is Darius Kell from Coastal Waves Radio. I was at the Marigold last night. What you played. It was extraordinary." Elira's throat tightened. "Oh, thank you. I'd love to have you on the show this Friday," he continued, already sounding like he was writing notes. "Live segment. Just you and the piano. We could even bring one into the studio. People are talking, Elira. This could be your moment." She glanced at Silas, who was pretending not to listen but had paused mid-stitch. I don't know," she said. "I'm not a performer. You don't have to be," Darius said gently. Just be yourself. That's more than enough. After she hung up, she sat on the stool by the window, staring at her hands. They looked the same as always, slightly calloused from bookbinding, nails short and practical. But now they felt different, powerful even, dangerous. That afternoon she walked down to the harbor, needing air. She passed the fish market, the ice cream stand, the little bench where Nana Morel used to sit and watch the boats come in. She sat there now, watching the water ripple under the pale sun. A part of her wanted to say yes to Darius, to step into the light just once. But another part, the older, quieter part, feared what would happen if she did. Would the music change if people expected it? Would it stop being hers? She didn't have an answer. Back at the shop, she found a small package on the doorstep. No note. Inside was a metronome. Old, brass with a chipped wooden base. Taped to it was a scrap of paper that read, "For keeping time with your own heart." She recognized the handwriting. Mrs. Ellery, the retired music teacher who used to give lessons in the church basement. Elira held the metronome in her palm. It was cool and solid. Real. That night she couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't anxiety keeping her awake. It was music. Not the full piece from the Marigold, but new ideas, fragments that wanted to be born. She got up, tiptoed downstairs, and sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a blank ledger page. She didn't write notes, she didn't know how, but she drew shapes, lines, waves. She mapped the feeling of the music instead. By dawn, the page was full. Friday came too fast. Darius called again, cheerful and persistent. "The studio's ready. We've got a beautiful baby grand. Just say yes, Elira, one song. That's all." She looked at Silas over breakfast. He sipped his tea, then said, "You don't owe anyone your music, but if you want to share it, I'll be there." That decided it. She said yes. The studio was smaller than she expected, warmly lit with soft curtains and a piano that gleamed under the lights. Darius greeted her with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're going to be amazing," he said, though she suspected he was talking more to himself than to her. As the broadcast hour neared, her hands grew cold. The producer handed her a glass of water. Darius adjusted his headset. Outside the glass wall, a small audience had gathered. Locals who'd heard the buzz. Curious strangers, even Torin, who gave her a shy nod. Then the red light came on. Darius's voice filled the room, smooth and warm. "Tonight we have someone very special with us. You may know her as the quiet girl from the bookbinding shop. But last week she reminded us all that sometimes the deepest voices are the ones we never hear." Until they sing, he turned to her. "Elira, welcome." She nodded, sat at the piano, and placed her hands on the keys. For a heartbeat, she panicked. What if she forgot? What if it didn't come? Then she closed her eyes and remembered Nana Morel's voice. "Listen first." She took a breath and played. Not the same piece as before. This one was newer, rawer, born from the past week's whirlwind of doubt, hope, and unexpected kindness. It began with a single questioning note, then another, then a cascade like rain finally breaking through a drought. Her fingers moved with a certainty she didn't know she had. The music swelled, full of longing, yes, but also joy, wonder, belonging. In the control room, Darius forgot to speak. The producer stopped fiddling with dials. Outside, people stood still, eyes closed, faces tilted toward the sound. When she finished, the silence was deeper than before. Sacred almost, then applause. Not from a studio audience, but from phone calls flooding in. Listeners from 3 counties over called to say they'd pulled their cars over to cry. A nurse on night shift said it gave her strength to keep going. A man who hadn't spoken to his daughter in years dialed her number right after the final note. Elira didn't hear any of it. She just sat there, hands resting on the keys, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from relief. The music hadn't betrayed her. It had held her. Later, as she walked home under a sky full of stars, she realized something. She wasn't playing for them anymore. She was playing because the music needed to exist. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days after the radio broadcast moved strangely, like time had softened at the edges. People still came into the bookbinding shop, but now they didn't just drop off damaged novels or ask about recovering cookbooks. They lingered. They asked how she was. Some brought small gifts, a jar of homemade blackberry jam, a smooth stone from the beach, a hand-stitched bookmark with a tiny silver moon stitched into the corner. No one demanded anything. They just wanted to be near the quiet girl whose music had somehow reached into their chests and untangled something they didn't know was knotted. Elira didn't know how to handle it. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this, but she also couldn't ignore the warmth in their eyes. The way strangers now nodded to her on the street like they shared a secret. It wasn't fame, not the kind that filled stadiums or sold records, but something quieter, deeper. A kind of belonging. Still, not everyone's intentions were gentle. A week after the broadcast, a man in a crisp navy suit showed up at the shop just before closing. He introduced himself as Julian Reeves, a talent scout from a small but well-connected label out of the city. He spoke smoothly, complimented her raw authenticity, and slid a contract across the counter like it was a gift. "We'd handle everything," he said, tapping the paper. "Studio time, promotion, even a tour. Intimate venues, nothing overwhelming. You'd keep creative control." "Mostly?" Elira read the first page. The words blurred together. Royalties, exclusivity, branding. It felt like someone was trying to put her music in a glass case, label it, and sell tickets to look at it. "I don't want to be packaged," she said quietly. Julian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone wants to be heard, Elira. This is how you make sure people keep listening." She handed the contract back. "I think they're listening just fine right now." He left without another word, but the encounter left her unsettled. That night she sat on the floor of her room, back against the bed, knees drawn to her chest. Was this what happened when you let your heart speak out loud? Did it always get turned into something you didn't recognize? Downstairs, Silas knocked lightly on the doorframe. "You okay?" She nodded but didn't look up. He came in and sat beside her, not too close. "You know," he said after a while, "your grandmother turned down a record deal once." Elira looked at him surprised. "She did?" "Yep, back in '78. Some fellow from Boston heard her play at a church fundraiser. Offered her a contract on the spot. She said no. Why?" Silas smiled faintly. "She told me music isn't meant to be owned. It's meant to be shared freely or not at all." He paused. "She also said the man's shoes were too shiny." Elira laughed. A real, unexpected laugh that loosened something tight in her ribs. The next morning she made a decision. Not because of Julian, not because of fear, but because of Nana Morell, because of the woman at the yarn shop who cried, because of the teenager who stopped scrolling, because music at its best wasn't a product, it was a bridge. She walked to the Marigold Lounge and found Rafe wiping down the bar. "Can I talk to you?" He leaned on the counter. "About the piano? Yes, I'd like to play again. But not just once, regularly, maybe once a month." Rafe raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Last time nearly broke the place in half from the inside out." "I know," she said. "But what if it wasn't just me? What if others could share too? Someone with a guitar, a poet, even someone who just wants to tell a story." Rafe stared at her for a long moment. Then he grinned. "You're talking about a listening night. Something like that. No microphones. No recordings, just people and what they carry." He nodded slowly. "I like it. We'll call it the Unplugged Hour. First Thursday of every month." "You're the anchor," she agreed, but only if it stayed simple. No tickets. No spotlight. Just chairs, the old piano, and an open door. Word spread fast. Not through ads or social media, but the old way. Over coffee at the post office, on fishing boats. The first Unplugged Hour drew a crowd that spilled onto the sidewalk. Elira played first, not her radio piece, but something new. Softer, like a lullaby for grown-ups. Then a retired lighthouse keeper named Orrin played a harmonica tune he'd learned in the Navy. After him, a baker named Leanne sang a folk song from her grandmother's village, her voice trembling but true. A high school student read a poem about watching his dad fix nets at dawn. No one clapped between acts. They just listened. And in that listening, something shifted in the room. A quiet understanding that everyone had a song, even if they'd never played it out loud. Afterward, people didn't rush out. They stayed, talking in low voices, sharing stories over mugs of spiced cider Rafe had brewed special. Elira sat near the piano, sipping tea, watching strangers become friends over shared silence and shared sound. Later, walking home with Silas beside her, she felt lighter than she had in years. "It felt right," she said. He nodded. "Because it wasn't about being seen. It was about being together." Back at the shop, she found a letter slipped under the door. No return address. Inside, on thick cream paper, was a single sentence in elegant script. "Thank you for reminding me that beauty doesn't need permission to exist." She didn't know who'd written it, but she tucked it into the drawer where she kept Nana Morell's old tuning fork. That night, she dreamed of the piano, not the one in the marigold, but the one from her childhood cottage. It sat on the beach, keys gleaming under moonlight, waves lapping at its legs, and when she played, the notes turned into birds and flew out over the water. She woke with a smile. The next morning, she began composing again, not for an audience, not for a contract, but for the joy of it. She wrote on napkins, on the backs of receipts, on the blank pages of discarded ledgers. Her music wasn't perfect. It stumbled sometimes, but it was honest. And in Brinley Cove, that was more than enough, because Elira had finally learned the truth. The world didn't need her to be famous. It just needed her to be real. And in that realness, others found the courage to be real too. Years passed, but not the kind that rush by in a blur. These were slow, steady years, the kind that settle into your bones like sea salt in sunlight. The unplugged hour became a fixture in Brinley Cove, as reliable as the tide and just as healing. Every first Thursday, rain or shine, the doors of the Marigold Lounge opened wide, chairs were arranged in a loose circle, and the old piano was dusted off with care. No one billed it as entertainment. It was something quieter, something truer, a space where people could bring whatever they carried: grief, joy, confusion, hope, and let it breathe out loud. Elira never became a star in the way the world usually measures stardom. She didn't tour. She didn't release albums. She turned down every offer that asked her to change her sound to fit a trend or wear clothes that didn't feel like her own. Instead, she stayed in the bookbinding shop with Silas, mending spines by day and playing piano by night, not for crowds but for connection. And somehow, that was enough, more than enough. Visitors began coming from neighboring towns, then counties, then states, drawn not by hype, but by word of mouth. A woman from inland drove 3 hours just to hear someone sing a lullaby in a language she hadn't heard since her mother passed. A retired teacher brought his students once a semester, telling them, "This is what real listening sounds like." Even Julian Reeves, the talent scout from years ago, showed up one evening, sat in the back, and left without saying a word, though he did leave a handwritten note on the bar. "You were right. Some things can't be sold." Elira kept playing, but she also made room. She invited others to take the bench, sometimes a teenager with a ukulele and shaky hands, sometimes an elder who recited poems from memory, sometimes just someone who wanted to share a story about losing a dog or finding a seashell shaped like a heart. There were nights when the music faltered, when voices cracked or hands trembled, but no one minded. In fact, those were often the nights people remembered longest. One spring evening, a documentary crew arrived, small, unobtrusive, with soft voices and gentle cameras. They weren't from a big network. They were students from a nearby college working on a project about quiet revolutions. They asked Elira if they could film an unplugged hour. She agreed, but only if they promised not to edit for drama, not to zoom in on tears for effect, not to turn real moments into spectacle. They honored that. Months later, when the short film premiered at a local arts festival, it didn't go viral. But it traveled. Libraries showed it. Community centers screened it. Teachers used it to talk about empathy. And after every viewing, someone would ask, "Where is Brinley Cove?" Not to visit as tourists, but to understand how something so simple could feel so powerful. At a Q&A after one screening, a young woman raised her hand. "What changed that night you first played at the Marigold?" she asked. "What made you finally do it?" Elira, sitting in the back row in a faded sweater and worn boots, smiled faintly. "Nothing changed," she said. "I just stopped hiding what was already there." That line stuck with people. It showed up on coffee shop chalkboards. It was quoted in sermons and school essays, not because it was clever, but because it was true. So many of us walk around with songs inside us, dreams, ideas, truths, that we're too afraid to share, convinced we're not ready, not good enough, not worthy of being heard. Elira hadn't fixed herself before she played. She'd just let herself be seen exactly as she was. Back in Brinley Cove, life went on. Silas's hands grew slower with age, so Elira took over more of the bookbinding. She learned to mix her own glue, to match leather grains, to press pages so they lay flat like calm water. She still played piano, but now she also taught just a few students, mostly kids who didn't fit in band class or teens who'd been told their voices weren't strong enough. She never taught them to chase perfection. She taught them to listen. Music isn't about getting it right, she'd say, placing their small hands on the keys. It's about saying something only you can say. One evening, as the sun dipped below the harbor, a little girl named Mira, named after Elira's grandmother, though no one had planned it, sat at the piano during an unplugged hour. She was 7 with wild curls and mismatched socks. She'd never played in front of anyone before. Her hands shook, but Elira sat beside her on the bench, not playing, just breathing with her. And Mira played a simple tune. 3 notes, repeated, then changed. It wasn't polished. It wasn't complex, but it was hers. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. They just smiled, nodded, some wiped their eyes. And in that quiet affirmation, Mira sat a little taller. Afterward, walking home with Silas leaning on a cane now, Elira felt a deep kind of peace. Not the kind that comes from success, but from belonging. She hadn't changed the world in a grand way. She hadn't built an empire or topped any charts. But she'd helped create a place where people felt safe to be human. Where a fisherman could cry without shame. Where a shy kid could find their voice. Where music wasn't a performance but a gift passed hand to hand, heart to heart, and maybe, she thought, that was the most important kind of music of all. Years later, long after the documentary had faded from memory, and the Marigold Lounge had been repainted twice, visitors would still come to Brindley Cove. They'd walk past the bookbinding shop, now run by a new generation, and stop at the small plaque near the harbor that read, "In this town, someone once played a song that reminded us we're never truly alone." They'd sit on the bench by the water, listen to the gulls, and sometimes, just sometimes, they'd hum a few notes of a tune they couldn't quite name, but somehow deep down already knew.